Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Henley's Leadership Webinar Series. My name is Layla Gilby, and I'm responsible for business development within the Executive Education Division at Henley Business School. Very shortly, I will be handing over to Professor Andrew Kakabadze, who will be running this session on boardroom effectiveness. Andrew is the Programme Director of Henley's flagship Board Directors Programme, which is now run in a fully online version of the programme, as well as face-to-face residential on Henley's amazing Greenlands campus. I'm also delighted this morning to welcome David Morris, Treasury CIO at Close Brothers. David was a participant on the first live online Board Directors programme and is here today to share his experiences and to answer any questions that you might have relating to the programme. I'd like to draw your attention to a number of things. Firstly, that this session this morning will be recorded. So after today, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar so that you can reference back to the session and listen to it at your leisure again if you do so desire. Secondly, you'll notice at the bottom of your screens there's a Q&A function. Please can you use the Q&A function to ask any questions of either David or Andrew or of our business development team, myself and Helen Robertson today. You can upvote questions, which means that you'll be putting the most popular questions to the top of the list to make sure that we answer them in the order that's relevant to you. If you have any general observations or thoughts, then please use the normal chat facility also at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the session, there'll be an evaluation form which we would love you to fill in. We'll pop the link in the chat facility, but also there'll be a pop-up box which will appear when you exit the session. And we'll also include a link in the follow-up email as well. You'll also be able to take advantage of virtual vouchers. So by participating in today's session, you would be entitled to a discount of 15% off the fees should you decide to go ahead and book onto any of Henley's open programs. So you'll just need to get in touch with myself or with Helen Robertson, and our contact details will be at the end of this presentation. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce you to Andrew Kakabadze, Professor of Governance and Leadership at Henley. Andrew has undertaken global studies spanning 20,000 organisations in 41 countries in the areas of board performance, leadership and policy delivery. He's published 45 books and 250 scholarly articles. Andrew consults with organisations across the globe and gives lectures at the world's top institutions. Without further ado, over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Layla. Good morning, everybody. You're most welcome. It's wonderful to have so many people from different parts of the world attending this program. Even one of my doctoral candidates from years ago is attending. So Jonathan, you're most welcome. The program, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, is based entirely on research. And what I'd like to do this morning is give you the research background to the program so you can see the logic of the program and what it's trying to achieve. Fundamentally, whether virtual or face-to-face, the program asks one question of every participant, and that is, are you board material? Do you wish to sit on boards? Do you understand how boards operate? And most of all, do you understand what an outstanding contribution you can make once you sit on a board and are fully active? Next slide, please. The research started not by looking at boards. I was not at Henley, I was at another institution, and we were looking at how can we develop leadership programs that basically will sell. So we began to look at some of the problems leaders have. So we looked at private sector, public sector, we looked at different countries, and there was one very interesting question. Why does there seem to be so much politics at the top of organizations? Why is life in a sense strained? Why aren't people talking the truth to each other? And that started a global series of studies, not just one. It's now, I think, 14 or 15 studies with some of the interesting results, which I'll now present. One interesting issue was, do we have alignment at the top? So when we say we're pursuing a strategy, Is the top team, is the board, are the general managers aligned? And what we found from our survey, from 20% NHS, stands for National Health Services in the UK, 21%, right through to 56% of the ministers and top civil servants in the Australian federal government. You would have these top people going to meetings, coming to a decision, walking out of the meeting and doing something entirely different. Now, what we found was, in fact, right across the world, 34% of the world's top teams are not aligned. They're not aligned on the vision, the mission, the strategy, the way the strategy is delivered. And we tried to find out why. Next slide, please. The other thing that we discovered, without first of all answering the question why, which surprised us, was when things go wrong, when a merger and acquisition does not work out, or there's a scandal or something has happened in the organization, it was amazing to us how many people knew of that. In fact, we did not find one organization where people did not know the nature of the most critical concern that they were facing. When we looked at the database, however, from 36% of our sample in France to 80% of our sample in China, everybody knew, but from 36 to 80, they dare not raise that uncomfortable issue. The feeling of discomfort in raising that topic, the feeling of being able to cope, the sentiment perhaps that you don't know quite how to talk to your boss, your credibility could collapse. In fact, 67% of some of the world's brightest people, males or females, well-educated, well-developed, well-experienced, found it impossible to raise the uncomfortable issue. So we had two interesting statistics. We had 34% of the world's top teams and boards were not aligned and continued to be not aligned, and 67% dare not raise that uncomfortable issue. So in a sense, misalignment is the norm. In a sense, tension is the norm. And in fact, if you wish to be abnormal, you have to do something extra to overcome some of these constraints. Next slide, please. One of the reasons why we have these problems is the term in the private sector, competitive advantage. In government, it would be the term value, or value that is delivered. We found that there were 2 points in the organization structure where competitive advantage was questioned or was not clear, or people took a different pathway. The first was at fracture point 1, which is where governance and strategy meet, and that is where the board and the top team start their discussion. However, that was not the most difficult fracture point. Fracture point number 2 was where the top team, the C-suite, actually was in conversation with their general managers, and a general manager could be the head of a country like Romania, or it could be a functional general manager in Europe who's the head of IT in Europe, but reports to the European structure, not to the headquarters structure. Next slide, please. Now, what we were finding at these fracture points were people were taking on a different interpretation of one term, competitive advantage. Funnily enough, the tension between the board and the top team, perhaps the top team being reluctant to disclose all the information to the board, and the message goes round, let's give the board what they'd like to hear. Yes, that is a problem, and yes, that is a concern, but it was nothing like fracture point number 2, where you would actually have dislike and despise at general management level. I remember one particular case of a major international company in the consumers business. The general manager for Germany had just returned from a trip to Chicago and laid out to his team exactly what was happening. And he basically said to them, this is what we've agreed at the center in Chicago. And if I catch any one of you implementing this, I will personally sack you. Now you might ask, how is this possible that you would have a senior general manager going against what the center would want? The concern, however, was the global branding strategy. And what was happening at the center, there was a view that this was the way the global brand was going to be presented. The general manager's concern in Germany was But if you do that in Germany, do you recognize in our business, which is household consumer products, the principal consumer is the German housewife? They will not be attracted to this brand, sales go down. And yet you expect me with this brand and its strategy to increase sales. How do I do that? So what we're finding is that in any structure, largely because of size, there are complexities. And what was once the domain of the management team, that they would sort out these problems, what we're now finding is that this is now a key responsibility for the board. Because this is no longer economics or strategy creation or sales and marketing data. This is much more cultural. And the board is the one vehicle which can oversee what's happening in the organization. And the question is, what are they going to do about some of the tensions they see, especially when those tensions repeat themselves and somehow or other they do not get resolved? Next slide, please. So we found some interesting statistics. For example, in Britain, 60% of chairman and chief executive officers consider themselves understanding and supportive of their teams, the board and the management team, and their general managers. 70% of their general managers disagreed. Let's take Germany. 75% of chairmen and presidents in Germany considered that they had established a culture of trust on the board, the management board, on the management team, and with their general managers. 67% of their general managers said, no, you've not. That's what you think. In Australia, APS, the Australian Public Service, basically the top said, we're not understanding and supportive of anyone. And the level said, below said, we know. And the top said, we don't trust each other. And we don't trust you guys either. And the level below said, we know that one too. So I don't know whether we're picking up here Australian honesty and Australian forwardness in comparison to everybody else. I suspect the problems with the Australian federal government when we intervened had become so extreme, there was no pretense left in the system. Next slide, please. Now, the statistics I presented to you ask the question, why boards? Boards are the vehicle for governance. And what is governance? From the very first governance structures that we knew 3,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, the intent of governance was oversight. I have below me a set of assets. Now, how do I oversee these assets in order that more value is delivered over my stewardship than previous stewardships? And for 3,500 years, again, the fundamental tools of oversight and governance have not really altered. They are compliance on the one hand, and the word I've just used now, stewardship. In many ways, dear friends, we have gone compliance crazy. We have one rule after another. We have one protocol after another. We have one process after another. Some of you may recall the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States. Well, the UK is going in exactly the same way. Greater controls, greater problems, greater concerns. And what happens? Not much. If we even go back to the 1980s, some of you may recall the scandal of Barings Bank, the Blue Arrow affair. If we go to Enron, if you go to Marconi, if you go to Royal Bank of Scotland, or HBOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland, or Carillion recently in the UK, there was a certain interesting relationship between all those organizations. And that was roughly 6-7 months before they collapsed, went bankrupt, or the scandal about them came to the surface. The press especially had identified those organizations as compliance fantastic. They were the model of compliance, particularly Enron and Marconi, for the rest of the market. In fact, Marconi was the premier company of the UK at that period of time. Underneath the surface, there were real problems. And the board and the management team were not addressing those. Now that falls under the domain of stewardship. To what extent does the board really understand what's happening? To what extent does the board have an instinct about some of the tensions in the structure? And does the board try and facilitate their way through those tensions and help management face up to those tensions and come, hopefully, to a reasonable conclusion? Or does the board feel that's management? Or does the management say it's management? Well, more and more data, more and more research indicates that the problem may be management, but the responsibility for some of these sensitive cultural concerns is the board. Next slide, please. So we started on board research. And in fact, our database now stands at about, as Leila indicated, 20,000 organizations. It's now 43 countries. And we have additionally about 5,000 boards across 14 countries. I'll just present two here as example. In the UK, we undertook a study of the FTSE 100, 200 and 300 companies. And fundamentally, we were trying to find out one very basic stuff. What do boards do? How do they do it? Do they add value? What we found for the UK was quite interesting at the time. Number one, many people thought the non-executive directors were not that useful. What the data show? Increasingly important. However, why you're on this board and how you got to this board and the selection criteria used to get you on this board, they were unclear. And at least for my comfort, there was too much of the networking, too much of the friendship, too much of the mateship type relationships. Do we know this person? Can we trust this person? And those questions, important as they are, were actually becoming more important than the contribution and experience of the candidate. What did surprise us was that 85% of our total sample of non-executive directors either did not know, could not tell you, or could not quickly recall what is the competitive advantage of the firm on whose board they sit. The same applied to differentiation, and differentiation is equally an important question. If we are going to be different from the marketplace, i.e. differentiation, against whom are we different? Give me the benchmark. Is it this company? Is it that company? Is it a company abroad? Who are we differentiated against? So we were finding whatever boards did, that basic insight was not really there. Next slide, please. So we then did a very interesting twist to our survey. We didn't plan to do it. It came roughly by watching these results emerge. Here you'll find two sets of lines, one sort of faint blue and one dark blue. We created our own criteria of board, director, chairman, senior independent director performance. We came up with about 60 or so criteria. The thin blue line or the soft blue line is how the board members rated themselves. So one board member on encouraging open debate, the board basically gave themselves out of 9, let's say 8.4. We then went to all those people who have something to do with the board, and most of them were the management. So if you were chief executive and you sat on the board, we did not go to the chief executive. That person was rated as a board member. But the director of HR, the director of information technology, may present to the board, but is not an active board member. We went to those managers, and what happened? On every rating, the managers downrated their board colleagues' contribution by about 40%. And basically the message that was given is, you think you're good, mate? Not as much as you think you are. Do you know that we did not find one company in the UK that the management could say, I fully trust my board? That interested us. So we asked the question, why this? Is your board perhaps not very competent? Is your board poorly selected? What is it? And the surprising comment back was, actually the board members themselves as individuals are pretty good. They're experienced, they're sharp, they're clever. You like to be with them professionally, you like to be with them personally, but they are out of touch. And that was the problem. They sit in the boardroom. They overdeal with compliance. And the reality of the stewardship and what is happening here, to try and get this information to the boardroom, they don't even leave the boardroom to find out reality. And for that reason, we cannot fully trust them. Next slide, please. So I went to the US. I have to say, I was so surprised. There was less defensiveness and inhibition on Russian boards than I found on US boards. What we tend to see is the same sort of companies, the Googles, the Apples, and so on, the outstanding boards. And when you get into the whole economic scene of the US, like everywhere else, of course, the picture is very varied. But what we found in the US was that people were and continue to be so compliance driven. Still, the chairman, chief executive, and president of the company, for something like now 70% of American corporations, is one and the same person. It used to be about 78%, so the number is reducing, but not by that much. Do you know how many companies we went to, American companies, where the board members had not met a manager in the company on whose board they sat at any point of their tenure? They had met the chairman, they had met the chief executive, they're one and the same person, but somebody else they had not. In fact, in certain companies, so that you don't get tainted, whatever tainted means, you're encouraged not to meet managers. So we found a compliance mindset devoid of stewardship sensitivities. And once a corporation gets big, once it leaves its governance domain, like the US, and goes to different parts of the world, that organization is deeply vulnerable. Next slide, please. So tension, concerns, things that need resolving, and in many cases, either not resolved well or just not resolved, is normal. What we wanted was to see a diversity of thinking. And we then broke that down into a number of questions. Are the leaders in the organization clear about the issues that face them? What did our survey show? Well, not really. Is there a shared view on competitive advantage? And what did our survey show? Not unless you've worked very hard on that. Is there a shared view on differentiation? So you can actually specify which company, against which company are we differentiated? Again, no, unless you worked very hard on that. Is there a shared view on value? No. So under these circumstances, what is the philosophy, that corporate glue, that cohesion that binds this organization together? And instead of having a diversity of thinking, a diversity of perspective, if you like, a rich debate, a rich dialogue with people from different views, with the confidence to express those views, what we found was a disruptive diversity. Next slide, please. And yet, one thing we could not ignore, and that is engagement. If people are going to deal with complex issues and they're going to deal with them in a mature way, realizing engagement is critical in order to achieve sustainable performance. Next slide, please. So what do we do? One thing we noticed is that the role of chair is now more important, if not exactly as important, as the role of CEO. In fact, we're finding chief executive officers are now slowly morphing themselves into chief operating officers, largely because of the amount of detail they have to handle, and in many ways, sometimes not even able to sit above their role to examine what are the issues under their care. So the chair is now becoming pivotal, which means the board is becoming pivotal. And the chair, in many ways, is the reflection of the confidence the external world has on this organization. Certainly, the chair is the keeper of reputation. The chair is the mechanism for understanding risk. But when it came to trust, shareholder trust, stakeholder trust, that was mandatory. If the chair and the board were not trusted, 10 years ago was the CEO on the management team. Now we have a problem. No matter how good your products and services that are offered and delivered by the management team. So the chair is now becoming a role model. The chair almost captures the philosophy of the company. The chair, in many ways, epitomizes the quality of strategic understanding and also strategic delivery. The chair, equally, if that role and person are not trusted, could be the very reason for the demise of the organization. What are we finding also? Chairmen and women are becoming so more important, and yet they're underpaid. Next slide, please. So what to do? Well, number one, let's recognize how important it is to be a non-executive director. And that is one of the reasons for these two programs, virtual and face-to-face. It's to help each person understand whether they're board material. It is to help each person understand what are these core skills that you need. And definitely one of the core skills is to have almost a forensic scrutiny capacity. Can you handle detail? Can you absorb so much detail when you get the volumes of board papers thrown at you and you are legally accountable for the decisions that you take based on that particular database? Secondly, are you sensitive enough as a person to appreciate the nature of context? Do you ask to go for site visits? Why particular site visits? Is it that you just want to see? Or do you actually focus your attention on those areas where you know there is attention, particularly in the delivery and execution of strategy? We call those fracture points. Do you try and understand what is the mindset of the management who sometimes cannot relate to what the corporate center is doing, and in many ways feel that the corporate center is not producing value? And the third question, and it's in this slide, what disciplines do you introduce? And what we found high-performing companies do is, yes, they have all the sensitivities, and yes, they have the scrutinizing capacity, but what differentiates them is the application of 6 disciplines. The role of chair and CEO from the Cadbury report was specified. This is the role, this is what you do. What are we finding in high-performing companies? With very changing circumstances and responding to market dynamics? That's not the case. The smart chair and the CEO get together and they delineate their boundaries according to market conditions and the strategies that they're pursuing. So in one company, what a CEO does could be taken in another company as most of the chair's role. That's not the problem. It's the agreement on our roles based on the strategy we're pursuing. And once we've done that for the chair and the chief executive officer, we can do the same for the board and management team. The second discipline, and you just go through evidence here, is sense making. Can you make sense of the strategic options we've got? Can you make sense why the top team is not aligned? Can you use data to show that, in fact, as a corporation, we're more sophisticated than having one sense of competitive advantage? We have many senses of competitive advantage, reflecting the needs of different parts of the world. How do we get that more sophisticated and clever way of thinking right through the board, into the top team, and then right through the structure? One thing that we found is if that sense-making process is not initiated by the board, you are left then to fortune as to whether some of the problems in the structure are managed well by the management team. The third discipline, it seems a strange one. How do we talk to each other? Now, you do have to have open debate, of course. You do have to defend different viewpoints, of course. You will use different data sources, evidence, of course. So a mindset of interrogation can take place. I'm reminded of Macquarie Bank in Australia, one of the most successful banks in the world. They have a particular philosophy. They've made it part of their culture. You interrogate the argument, never the person. And Macquarie Bank, even for board members, introduced psychometrics to see how gently you handled people, but how deeply you went into arguments. What do we find on many boards and management teams? You may intend to interrogate the argument and the evidence behind that, but you end up interrogating the person and making them defensive and feeling uncomfortable. Which role in particular has the responsibility to create a culture of interrogate the argument, not the person? It's the chair. It's that oversight. It's how the chair handles these dialogues, which can damage people, damage the organization, prevent good data coming up, but equally, when well done, has all the data and evidence on the table for us to make a meaningful decision. The fourth discipline. Are politics between us going to take place? You bet. What is politics? Politics is the negotiation of the impossible to the possible. Ancient Greeks, politics comes from polis, the people, the interaction between people. So politics is nothing more than how we converse under conditions of complexity. Now, how we delicately balance handling people with respect, and then at the same time influencing outcomes. And as a board member, you will need to influence outcomes. You will need to influence a particular point of view. You may have an agenda. You may have a viewpoint that you wish to have accepted by the board. How you delicately handle open conversation with influencing people and getting them more onto your point of view than everything else is an interesting matter. And that is also an additional part of the program. What we found, and it surprised us, was living the values of the organization. And you'll see in so many organizations, the value statements, the list of values you've got from integrity, trust, different forms of ethics. That was the fifth discipline. And we found in high-performing companies, each of the disciplines come in sequence. And it's not until you have done the previous four, how you handle people, how you make sense of strategy and markets, how you establish your roles and delineate between roles. It is then within that foundation that you can actually now specify the values that you think are important for your organization. Let's take a major international corporation like Caterpillar. They have one value, quality. Yes, they have others, but it's one, it's quality. And that quality is based on a way of operating from top to bottom. So if you go into various parts of Caterpillar, or at least when I knew them, it was called dressed in yellow. The yellow overalls that the people that say on the shop floor or in the market or in the community wear, that is worn by management. That is almost the dress of the whole organization. What it's trying to denote is that the values between us make each one of us just as important as the other. And once you have that way of living, then you can express the values because you can genuinely say it is these values that drive us. And the final discipline, how do we develop the team and the board? Well, first of all, do the previous five and then emerge with a developmental process and assessment process that makes sense for you. That's what we found. Our program has many guest speakers. They are, in one sense, giving their own view on each elements of this presentation. But what, in a sense, we're trying to do is establish a practice of stewardship, which is so missing across our organizations, so that we can have greater alignment and a more diverse perspective, which will enable this organization and its employees and the shareholders and stakeholders who depend on it to have confidence about its future. Thank you. David.
Good morning, everybody, or should I say good evening and good night, and a very early morning, because I believe we're being joined globally by many people, which is really exciting. My name is David Morris. I'm a Chief Information Officer at Close Brothers Bank. This is a merchant bank based in the UK, and it's a FTSE 250 public company. Let me share with you this morning my journey to the Henley course. Last year, I actually reached 40 years in technology. And though it's fair to say that you never stop learning, on balance, I felt I had a lot to give. I'd learned a lot in 40 years, and I felt I could bring my wider experience of technology for the benefit of the company. Within the group company, there were a number of NED non-executive director roles vacant. And with that in mind, I applied to Henley. For me, I actually just wanted the answer just to two questions. Firstly, is being a NED, is it for me? And secondly, if so, what are the guiding principles to that role? My buying decision was straightforward enough. Henley comes with an excellent reputation, and some of my colleagues had been on previous courses and had a really positive experience. So for me, it was an easy choice, and the timing was excellent. The onboarding process was really smooth, and even though Henley had only recently moved to virtual delivery, you would not have known it because everything worked out of the box. So when this course is normally run face-to-face in Henley, I believe that the whole event is sandwiched into 2 days. And whereas there are real benefits to that, the efficiency, the opportunity for networking, and the location, which is elegant, I found that taking the material over a series of weeks really helped me to reflect and absorb what had been presented. And I could argue actually that presentation is as beneficial, different, but no less valuable. And you will not lose out on the richness of the content when it's delivered virtually. So as well as answering those basic 2 questions, the course also covered for me questions such as, how do you navigate the corridor between being a critic on the one hand and a counsel on the other? What are the key boardroom dynamics you need to know? How do you know what an effective board looks like and operates? How do you market yourself as a NED? What are the avenues? Also, what are the risks and what are the opportunities? But fundamentally, the question also answered, what's it going to be like for you? So textbooks, no matter how well written, never capture the true nature of what it's like to be in business. As Andrew said, the people, the politics, the personalities. And I think listening to the speakers at Henley really brought that to life for me. Because business is real, it's not some academic tract. And for me, it felt I was inside that boardroom. So as they say on BBC Radio in the UK, when somebody unashamedly plugs a commercial product, the speaker normally says, reminds people that other courses are available. However, if you're looking to answer some of those questions and more beside, I really believe that you will get those answered by this course at Henley. It certainly did that for me. And so thank you for your time this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. And I really want to wish you the very best as you work out your own development goals. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There are some very interesting questions. If I can take them as they seem to have come up here. Beauty Bapiro asked a very interesting question about rules concerning raising issues on the board. Why do the issues have to go through the chair? Beauty, that does not sound like a good practice to me. What I found with good chairs is that they ask for evidence to support each of the questions, and then they have the person that is putting that question forward to stand in front of the board, sit in front of the board, and make their case, and then be questioned, discussed, debated with the board. The board may not like it, the board may like it, but that person is there making their case, which hopefully is evidence-based. When things go too much through the chair, that's over control for me. The real purpose of the chair is to get that balance between questions that make sense and don't waste time, questions that don't deviate from where the direction we're trying to go, and hopefully points made which are evidence-driven, and the evidence-driven bit is important. And that is just a matter of sequencing. Marjorie, female views, and do they show any difference? The number of females we had in the survey more depended on site. So for example, in our National Health Service database, the number of females, I think, were 52% of the total database. If we go to the Australian public sector, they were about 45, 44%. But overall, the number of women in the whole database was around 39 to 41%. And the reason I'm not too clear, it keeps changing survey by survey. But it was fundamentally, if you like, 2/5. What was interesting was that gender made no difference. Education made no difference. Funnily enough, background made no difference. The only demographic that made a difference was age. And it was interesting to see the older the better. Those individuals that had taken a lifestyle and a life way of approaching their own life based on development, those were the ones that were invaluable because they had reached a particular point where they had nothing more to gain. Everything was about delivering value, helping other people. And so with the skill of time and the subtleties of time, they were able to enter into some of the most delicate conversations and help move those conversations forward. And it made little difference if you were male or female. We equally found age to be a bit of a concern at the younger end, where too much of pushing things through and trying to force an alignment without the necessary engagement as the foundation or background, that could be a concern as well. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have women on boards. Of course we should. 51% of the world's population is women. So the concern that we've got is how do we get more women on boards as a development process, but on this board, what value are you going to deliver as a person? And we found that to be the invaluable question. And we found an inconsistency in the response to that question. So you may, as a male, be contributing great value on this board, but not on the next one. What did we find? Equally the same for women. So the question is not so much gender, but it is, why are you on this board? What can you offer? Are we representative of the population at hand? Have we taken note of the best candidates coming to this board? Have we provided developmental opportunities, especially for newcomers to the board, people from an ethnic background or women? Have those issues been addressed? But your particular question of what makes a difference in terms of performance on the board, it's fundamentally just you. Anything to add to that, David?
I think on a personal front, we're very pleased in our own board. We have a very, very good gender mix, which has happened, I would say, not through design, but just through the fact that the individuals concerned are the best people for the role. And so we never actually set that out to achieve some parity, but we have achieved it just through the sheer excellence and quality of all the candidates. So, you know, it's to echo what you said, it's not necessarily a device that comes down to who the best people are in that time.
As an example, Marjorie, F International, I used to know them some time ago, and when I knew them, the board and the management team were all women except one person. We had at the time a male director of finance. I can tell you this was a fantastic board. The women on the board didn't see themselves as women. They saw themselves as board directors who had a particular function and a contribution to make. And those women were as vocal and as harsh and as supportive with each other based on the business issues that they were dealing with, based on the strategy that they were trying to pursue. When I knew them, those women were going for a buyout. They made an excellent, created an excellent organization. And as far as I know of the ones that still remain, they're multimillionaires. They've done an excellent job. So whether it's women, whether it's men, whether it's a mix, the mix is the diversity of perspective that enables strategy and achieves sustainability. That's the mix that's needed. Then on top of that, what do we do with people who are newcomers to the board? That's the question. I got here, Brian. Is there assistance or reliance that we should provide opportunities? Difficult question. Probably more difficult to respond to. Brian, what I've learned from all this is until you've gone on a board and until you've experienced the reality of the board and been held to account for what's happening on the board, and in many ways, if you're not performing or contributing and you feel that and you feel how awful that can be to you, that as a person, the board members don't really respect you because of the lack of contribution you're making, you are not really being blooded into board membership. So by all means, go through any form of development, sit with board members. But what I have found to be of value is sharing with people what have been their board experiences. And then, if you like, even taking them to a psychometric level where, by the way, we've created our own tests for various board members, giving people feedback on how they're likely to perform in various boards under various conditions. So the more we can replicate the reality of the engagement process on the board, the better you can prepare people. Just sitting and watching, I'm not sure that that helps that much. But David, you may have a different opinion.
Slightly. In my particular circumstance, as a result of the course, I realized becoming an ed was a significant commitment, not just in time, but in terms of personal liability. So, in fact, what I've arranged in the company, I actually have joined the two boards of the company as a member of their executive committees, respective members. And so I've joined those for 3 months, and that's an opportunity for me to get to know the company and they to get to know me. And if that's successful in a general sense, then actually I will sign on the dotted line and become a non-executive director. So I've been fortunate. I kind of have a try before you buy. There has the advantage that I am familiar with those companies already, so it's not as if I'm a stranger and they know me as well. But I have an easier entry into that world. So I think it worked out well for me. I hope it will. So that might be a technique you might want to consider.
It sounds good. So really what happened to you, David, is that you were exposed to the context in which you're going to be as a future board member, and you had to start making the relationships and getting involved a little bit earlier than would have been. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm already sort of having a sort of dialogue with the executives on that board to get to know their business. And I think in a way, just to call back, one of the challenges for me that actually, which again the course helps with, is just making sure I do attain a NED role, not an operational role, as a result of those conversations. So I have to be very careful about my own sort of separation of duty as I do that piece of work. So I think it's a helpful idea, but I think you also have to be very careful about what that early engagement looks like.
It sounds excellent. We should definitely bring that onto the program, David.
Yep.
Montserrat, you asked about diversity. The diversity that's important is the diversity that adds value to the board, the organization, and its strategy. So I know of one airline company that has, for example, a TV executive on the board, male. It has a few females on the board, which have nothing to do with airlines. And the reason is that this is a low-cost airline that is competing against one or two other low-cost airlines on service, not necessarily price. So what they did was they thought that on this board, we need someone who really appreciates service. We need someone who really appreciates how to promote a brand of service, but it's at the lower end of the market. And so they built their board around the enabling factors that would make strategy work, that would help management, but also they brought people onto the board who were able to stand back, and if they needed to make a critical comment about management, and particularly the chair needed to sack the CEO or recommend that particular members of the top team were not performing, they could do that as well. So they could zoom in, they could zoom out, but they had a very particular function. And at least what I have found is that's the diversity that works. It's the diversity that enables strategy, bearing in mind a realistic appreciation of market conditions. David, this would be something for you to respond to as well.
It's quite interesting, actually. I have a personal example, maybe not a commercial one, but rather interesting. My daughter, when she was 19, was actually co-opted to be a director at the local theatre, and so because they felt they needed to have a young person because they had a lot of youth programs as part of that theatre, and so she became a director long before I did, so it was quite useful. But what I found actually as a result of her co-opting to that board at that young age was how much she learned from it. How much she learned from actually mixing with old people and subjects that she'd no familiarity with. And so again, if people are actually on that precipice of should I, shouldn't I would recommend to progress and go ahead with it, because you will learn. And then likewise, you know, a course like this will also help to give you that sort of framework to make sure you have the right information to help you through your decisions. So that was quite interesting for me in terms of how a young person actually developed a lot through her co-opting to a board at a very young age.
Excellent. And did you feel that that young person had the maturity to work on that board, the understanding of how boards work, just a basic understanding?
It was a learning place.
Uh-huh.
But it was interesting over the period of a number of years. She went from sitting quietly in the corner to actually contributing and making points, and you know, much more assertive, which has benefited her as well. But I think it's also, you know, one of the things that came out of the training was to recognize that being a board member, your contribution is over years, maybe not months. And so that was another learning I took away from the course was, you know, being a board member is important and pivotal. You can contribute, but don't expect necessarily to turn a company on a dime. It's a long-term commitment and it's a long-term contribution.
Interesting. Thank you. We have a very interesting question from Giles Vardy on the chair and digitalization. Giles, this is one of the most critical questions for the future. I'm not going to be able to fully satisfy your question with my answer, because what we're doing is we're actually researching the very nature of your question. We're researching the role of the chair in digitalization. We're researching the role of independent directors, how data gets presented to the board. What is the board's responsibility? Do they really need to understand the technologies behind digitalization and new IT developments, or do they really need to understand the questions they should ask of management? And because data now more quickly goes to the board for decision making, and if you can create the compliance mechanisms to have evidence, sound evidence coming to you, does that then have a stewardship kickback in the sense that with this data, the reality of how life is lived at various fracture points in the structure, does that experience become even more alien to the board member? They get even more out of touch. The initial findings are interesting. It's the chair's responsibility to determine what is the purpose of digitalization. So just that basic core understanding of the function and what it can add and how that fits with the business, that basic understanding is vital. Do we understand how many chairs have that? We do not. But what we are trying to do, and we are creating, is going to be a program called the Digital Director, and how your role is changing over time. Certainly, the two things that have emerged is the chair is now more important than ever in this period. And secondly, the concern over stewardship is becoming a deep concern. That too much data quickly given and an assumption that the data, although accurate, is capturing the experience at that fracture point. That is our concern. And that is the need even more so now to have an emphasis on stewardship. Certainly, as part of this program, the nature of the digital director will be a core element. I'm sorry, Charles, I can't give you a better answer, but at least we're trying to understand the balance between the data efficiency, compliance, and discipline side versus the stewardship side. And all that we're picking up at this moment is that those organizations are now becoming a bit too lopsided. David, your experience?
It's a fantastic question. It really is. I think a couple of things to say. Firstly, there are lots of technologists who have actually very lengthy experience and can work effectively on boards and understand what's happening here. And I count myself as one of them. So, you know, technology has been around a long time. So there are good candidates out there who can join a board with specific optics of technology. And I think it's really important to have a separation of duty from the organization developing digital capability and a board that can question the efficacy of it. It's a very fashionable concept right now, and lots of investments have been made. Some have been better than others. And I think everybody wants their organization where appropriate to have a digital posture and a digital strategy. And I think, though, it's really important for the board themselves to actually have elements of their own skills in-house to evaluate those strategies. And if they can't source that inside their own competency, maybe that is an opportunity for a third party to provide that sort of separation of duty and governance around that as well, because it's too important a question just to be left outstanding without real governance against it.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Jayanta, you asked a question about board of directors and power to carry out their functions and how do they maintain a good relationship with the chairman of the board. The board isn't empowered to carry out its functions. It's up to them to establish what is their functions that they should concentrate on at this moment in time that enables strategy, that minimizes risk, that enhances reputation, and all the things that we've discussed. Maintaining a working relationship, a positive working relationship, not only with the chair, but with each other, is vital. And that is one of the concerns. How do we deal with difficult issues? How do we work through misalignments and at the same time maintain engagement and maintain relationship with each other as colleagues? And that's why what we noticed with the high performing boards and companies, the introduction of those disciplines that I was talking about. And one of them is, believe it or not, a discipline about how we talk to each other. So how do I, as Andrew, get from you the sort of data I want? And I know that, for example, your case and this board is weak, and I need to bring that to the surface without making you feel uncomfortable, without making you feel almost second rate, without making you feel that you are respected and honored as a board member. You've taken a different point of view. It's not worked out. So how we do this balance and how we achieve this balance, not only as chair, but as board members, is vital. And that is why on more the face-to-face program, and perhaps with a virtual program with the coaching that takes place at the end, one of the questions that I put to certain individuals is, do you actually want to sit on a board? And probably in my professional life, about 30% or so of the people I come across, I'm probably trying to advise them not to sit on a board because they don't have the qualities necessary for boards. They may have immense qualities for other parts of life, but not for the scrutinizing and sensitivity requirements of a board. Richard asked a very interesting question about class action lawsuits in the States. Yes, that is one reason. You're absolutely right, Richard. And also the emphasis of American boards more devoted to share price and shareholder rights than anything else. But American companies live on a world stage where numerous stakeholders have to be addressed. So we still have the same concerns with risk, with reputation, with things going wrong, with share price being damaged because there are certain sensitivities that you didn't deal with. And we've seen examples of that both in the UK and the US. So there may be a history of legal priorities in US boards, on US boards, but that does not take into account what's needed for the future. I think it is just a world development that we're going more and more into compliance and not looking at the reality of stewardship. And one reason for that is certain boards may not be willing to face up to what's really happening in their organization and in their supply chain because they could face some sort of legal action. Well, that's one reason why they're on the board. They should face up to that. So irrespective in a complex world where you're crossing different governance domains, being worried too much about lawsuits, it means that all that's happening is that you're allowing issues to slowly fester, which will ultimately come to the surface and damage the organization. And Marjorie, you said, I can't help thinking that it is a trap causing a lot of toxicity in organization. It needs both compliance and stewardship. Absolutely. The original terms were mentoring and monitoring. And would you believe it, in 1925, they didn't come out of Harvard Business School. Those terms came out of Harvard Law School, who were advising Harvard Business School on the future governance umbrella of the nation called United States. And it was interesting to see what Harvard Business School did with the advice given to them by Harvard Law School. They rejected it. And they went for compliance and not the mentoring side, which we today call stewardship. Dear friends, it's coming to 11 o'clock, perhaps, unless, David, can you see from the questions given, is there anyone you'd like to answer? I can do the same, a quick answer.
The quick answer about, does the age dynamics of the chair make any difference in terms of effectiveness? Well, personally, I don't feel so whatsoever, but maybe I'm biased.
Actually, what I'm supporting David, for those active, developmentally minded individuals, what we're finding is the older the better. I know 1 or 2 board directors who are 81 and 82, and by gum, if you could see their energy, their drive, their insight, and especially that powerful intellect based on experience, they are really in high demand. It's irrespective whether they're male or female, by the way. Gender's got nothing to do with it. There are many questions. I don't think we'll be able to answer them all. Richard Langley, what advice would you give to somebody joining the board for the first time? The advice is, why have you joined? What value are you going to bring? Have you thought that through? Is the board clear on the value they need on the board? Is the board clear about the value that you bring to the board? The quicker you get into answering those questions, the more defended you will be with any board into the future. These are the questions, at least from my experience, in terms of joining a board. David?
You absolutely have to be clear on what you are looking to do on a personal level. If you're not, you will discover you will be sidelined by events. You need to be clear. And it was also very interesting, actually, the course covered people who exited a board because they felt it wasn't right for them. So that was a very rich example of how this works in real life. So you need to start that with a very clear vision for what you're looking to achieve, and then that helps to guide you through your career as a board member.
Thank you. I noticed Daisy and John Wartig, you're in a sense asking the same sort of question about specialists and generalists. I'm the one that feels we do need specialists on the board. I mean, I sit on educational boards, educational trusts. I have sat on other boards, and I feel I am so much of an advantage if I know the market, if I know how the whole market and strategy operates, if I know where this organization is in the market. I feel we have underplayed the specialist contribution. Now, of course, we need generalists. And I gave the example of an airline company that had somebody from TV sitting on their board, and they made a great contribution. But also on the board of that airline company were very distinct specialists who could interpret and make use of their generalist colleagues. And I think that is one issue that we need to consider for the future. Should we now have more specialists on the board who really know the position of this organization in its particular marketplace? David, anything to add?
Yeah, a case study in point, very contemporary. If you look at the makeup of board members on the pharma industries, they are expert pharmacologists, and hasn't that worked out for our advantage? And that, so I think it's really important to have those deep skills relative to the vertical industry you're serving on the board.
I agree. Nosipo, I feel we should answer your question. I left it to the end to give you a little bit of time, because you asked about, as a lady chair, how do you get the respect of your board members? This is a distinctly sensitive, delicate issue, and you're very right to ask it. What we're finding, just to repeat myself, is that there is no fundamental difference between males and females as far as board performance is concerned. It's you as a person. But then how you deal with some of these prejudices is a very important issue. In certain circumstances, you may not be able to. The prejudices are so deep. If you feel that you have a contribution to make, and that becomes the focal point, and then get the board focused on the contribution that is needed from this board, so that attention is taken away from gender or race or religion to just focusing on contribution from each board member, then I believe that is the way forward. I sympathize deeply with the question that you raised, because it's almost as if you're experiencing gender disparities in your particular country. Is there any way that you can get some people that you know to come and address the board about what is best board practice, to address the board on what are the components of a good board, the disciplines the board requires, what is the difference between male and female, and is there any difference in performance at this particular level? What are the skills and capabilities required on a board? So you are in a very interesting situation of almost educating your board about performance, contribution, and sustainability. And if you can bring the gender issue into that and show that we need people of diverse backgrounds and not always the same people as the board progresses over time, but we need that diversity on the board, and that diversity has been well thought through, I believe it may help. David, I think this is an interesting question for you. I know we're running over time, but it'd be good for you to respond to this one.
You know, my sense in a funny way is we have to make a start. You know, and I think what might happen over time is that individuals may find it doesn't work out well for them personally, and it may not be repaired in their tenureship as a board member because of the nature of the world. But I think we have to start and try, and ultimately, I think over time, those barriers will be knocked down. And I know it probably doesn't help a specific situation right now, but I think it shouldn't stop us from continuing to try.
I agree.
Thank you so much to Andrew and to David. I just want to now quickly outline for you the overview of our live online board directors programme and also our face-to-face version of the programme. So you can see on this slide that the programmes are delivered between 12 o'clock and 1:30 GMT, and the programme itself is spread across 6 sessions. So one interesting thing about the live online programme is that you start with the same participants that you finish with. So there's a real opportunity for networking with executives at the very highest level in organisations across the globe. So I think David would say that the networking has been really helpful and interesting from his perspective, and definitely that's a factor that we hear time and time again through our evaluation forms. So you would sign up either just by applying directly online, or you can contact either myself or Helen Robertson, and our contact details will be in the follow-up email that you'll receive after today. As Andrew mentioned, we also run the programme face-to-face on campus, and we're very hopeful that the campus will be open again in June for face-to-face delivery. So it's a 2-day programme, and you'd be very welcome to come and experience Greenland's campus and be within our residential setting for your learning there. As we mentioned at the top of this session, you'd be entitled to a 15% fee reduction if you sign up as a result of coming to this session, which would mean that if you sign up to the online programme, the fee would work out at £1,695 British pounds plus VAT. And if you were to decide to come to the face-to-face version of the programme, the fee is just a tiny bit under £2,000. Our contact details are on the bottom here. So if you have any queries at all, then don't hesitate to get in touch and we'll do what we can to help.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just at least respond to Dr. Ramanuja. Compliance, too much compliance, does it affect sales performance? What I have seen at least is not directly, but overemphasis on compliance does create a mindset of attending to internal processes. And the more you attend to internal processes and become less sensitive to market needs, sales needs, the sales sensitivity begins to drop. So eventually, in a culture such as this, you will see a sales repercussion, but it won't be there. And one of the problems why in many organizations an overemphasis on compliance continues is that the deterioration process is slow. It's a bit like the frog in boiling water. It just slowly gets used to the situation that it's in. And that, I think, is the biggest problem. And finally, Satinder, first board role to avoid is the one that actually is going to get the worst out of you. The board role that you should take on is the one that you feel you can add value. Smaller company, yes, why not a charity? Why not a third sector organization? Just to get you used to working in a board, as David gave the example of somebody who was learning and sitting by boards, trying to understand how to operate. So please be very aware of your learning curve once you go onto your first board, the value you provide, how much development you need, and perhaps that may guide you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, may I say, adding to Leila, it's been wonderful to be conversing with you, sharing ideas with you. I hope you found this session useful, and you never know, we might even see you virtually at Henley or actually physically at Henley. Both are excellent. Thank you very much for today. And thank you to my Henley colleagues for setting all this up.
Thank you, and we'll be in touch.
All the very best, everybody.